It is the 5th of August 1930, and the Norwegian sealer, the MS Brattvaag, drops anchor near a remote and desolate island in the Arctic Circle. The island, known simply as White Island, is usually inaccessible. Thick bands of dangerous sea ice encircle it from all directions, and poor visibility from the unpredictable weather makes it a perilous place for a ship to approach. This season, however, the Brattvaag is able to get close, and a party disembark, keen to use the opportunity to document the area and to hunt walruses that have been spotted on the shore nearby. However, the party is about to stumble across something else, something far more disturbing. In the distance, half buried in the snow, they make out what looks to be a boat, but as the men approach, they realise it's not just a boat. It is the remains of an entire abandoned camp. The ruined dinghy, strapped to a sledge, is packed with old equipment, clothing, food, provisions, even guns. Scattered around are even more weather-beaten boxes and other equipment. And just nearby, propped against a rock, is what looks like a broken tent or shelter of some sort. Carefully picking their way through this eerily quiet camp, the group realise it is far from abandoned. The occupants, or what is left of them, are still here. A skull and part of a spine jut from the frozen ground. Amid the ruined tent, a body sits propped up, seemingly facing what had been the doorway, a rifle still sitting by its side. In the breast pocket of the corpse's rotting tunic, still clinging to the bones of its former owner, is a small diary. Perhaps most grisly of all, about 115 feet away, a rough cairn of stones covers another body, wedged into the rocks in a makeshift grave. Skeletal feet still protrude from beneath the stone, clad in cracked leather boots. The men of the Brattvaag can hardly believe what they are seeing. The boat and its piles of abandoned equipment, the books and materials, they're all marked with the same words: Andrée's Polar Expedition 1896. They had stumbled across the remains of one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in polar history, a Swedish expedition that had aimed to cross the North Pole by balloon. The plan had been to launch from nearby Spitsbergen, to be carried by the air currents across the pole, gently guiding the balloon using a system of sails and drag ropes, and then returning safely, becoming the first men to reach the top of the world, and planting there the flag of Sweden in the process. But when the three men, Solomon Augustus Andrée, Niels Strindberg and Knut Frankel, drifted north in their balloon on the 11th of July 1897, they had disappeared. In the weeks and months that followed, there was hope that they might still appear from the frozen wastes. But as the weeks turned to months and the months to years, hope faded to a grim silence. 3 decades later, on the frozen shores of White Island, the ghosts of these men were now reaching out, their skeletal hands clutching the books and film canisters that may finally have pieced together the harrowing story of how they came to die on this remote and desolate island. But where was the balloon? How far had they travelled? Had they reached the North Pole? And how had Solomon Augustus Andrée, Knut Frankel and Niels Strindberg finally met their end? It is early July 1897, and Solomon Augustus Andrée stands on the rocky frozen shore of Danes Island, at the edge of the Arctic archipelago of Spitsbergen. Before him looms a vast 4-storey wooden structure, creaking in the cold wind. Inside, suspended in its skeletal frame like a bloated chrysalis, a huge balloon strains against its guy ropes, eager to break free. Andrée is a careful and phlegmatic mind. To those around him, his emotions often feel inscrutable. He approaches all tasks with a cold, calculating and confident air, and this confidence is almost hypnotising. But now, standing alone in the cold here on Danes Island, Cracks are beginning to appear in André's usually confident and emotionless outlook. Reality seems to gnaw at him. The balloon, the centrepiece of his expedition, the vessel he has spent years creating, travelling the world extolling its features and design, that will in only a few days carry him and his 2 crewmates to the North Pole, doesn't work. By all accounts, the balloon is a masterpiece, a marvel of 19th century craftsmanship. It is 1,320 square metres of the highest quality Chinese silk, stitched from 600 individual panels, with kilometres of seams holding it all together. Suspended below the vast balloon is a small wicker gondola, holding the sleeping compartment as well as a vast array of instruments and supplies. Andrée himself has overseen every element of the design. In the cold winds of Danes Island, the balloon seems almost alive, rippling, breathing, straining to break free. But despite the meticulous design, the cutting-edge construction, every morning the balloon seems to hang a little lower. Despite their best efforts, the hydrogen gas that keeps it aloft seeps invisibly and constantly through millions of tiny flaws, the stitched seams, under the varnished patches, through the very weave of the silk itself. No matter how many times it is coated in varnish, or how often the team chases phantom leaks across the vast envelope, more gas continues to pour out. Andrée had once boasted that the balloon could remain aloft for a month. In fact, the entire expedition hinged upon this very feature. Now he wonders if it will last even a week. This is their second summer here, and their second attempt to launch, and for Andrée it must be the last. The previous year, after departing Gothenburg to wild cheers and celebrations, they had failed. Complications, delays, unforeseen problems had beset them from the start. The balloon had also struggled to inflate, but more crucially, they had waited and waited for a southerly wind that Andrée himself had predicted would carry them to the pole. Instead, it blew stubbornly from the north, trapping them at the launch site. 1 year later, they have returned. The balloon house has been repaired. The hydrogen generators hum away, slowly re-inflating the balloon, which has been altered and further patched to make it, hopefully, more airtight. The gondola is packed and filled with supplies, and André's 2 crewmates are preparing for departure. The youngest is Niels Strindberg, and he now sits in the balloon house one night, watching the half-filled balloon slowly inflate above him. He is writing in his diary and composing a letter to his fiancée Anna. They had become engaged in October 1896, and Niels is madly in love. Anna is a music teacher and a governess at a school, and that spring Niels had taken the steamer each weekend from his home in Stockholm down the coastline to the school in Johannesdal to visit her. Now, seated beneath the towering balloon and contemplating what's ahead of him, that memory must have felt more remote than ever. Leaving Anna behind to travel here has tortured Niels, but he feels a sense of responsibility and loyalty to Andrée, having come this far already. He is worried about the balloon and the leaks, but he tries to trust in their plans to convince Anna and himself of their success. It is strange to be sitting here again this year, thinking how I am engaged to the most wonderful girl on earth, my dearest Anna. Yes, I might shed a tear when I think about the happiness I have known, which may never again be mine. But let me be hopeful. The balloon is varnished and ought to leak much less than last year. Summer lies before us with the favourable winds and the shine it brings. Why should our endeavour not be successful? I do truly believe it, unreservedly. Next to him is his calendar, and Anna has attached a farewell card to it, of a balloon drifting into the air. She has sketched a small drawing of herself beneath it, waving the vessel away. Niels dreams of his return, of a life with his future wife back home in Sweden. It is the 21st of June, 1897. In 20 days, the expedition will launch. In 3 months, Niels will be dead. Salomon Augustus Andrée is flustered. sitting in the halls of the British Geographical Society, he has just presented his grand plan for a flight to the geographic North Pole by means of balloon. Earlier in the year, he had presented the same plan to the Swedish Anthropological and Geographical Society, as well as several other institutions that are leading at the forefront of Arctic science and exploration. As a Swedish newspaper described his plans, Mr. Andrée has presented his grand plan for a balloon expedition to the pole. We cannot accompany this portrait of Mr. Andrée today with anything better than a brief summary of the lecture he gave to the Academy, in which he explained his plans to reach the North Pole using summer winds and a balloon. Conditions for a polar balloon. What are André's essential requirements for a polar balloon? They are: 1. The balloon must be able to carry 3 passengers, scientific instruments, food for 4 months, and ballast, together about 3,000 kilograms. 2. It must be gas tight, enough to remain airborne for 30 days. 3. It must be filled in the polar regions. 4. It must be, to some degree, steerable. The expedition will depart from Europe in early summer, aiming to launch near the northwest coast of Spitsbergen, where the balloon hangar will be built. The launch will occur in July, once the air is clear and a steady southerly or southwesterly wind is blowing. It is entirely fitting that a Swedish national should make this bold attempt. With our climate, our history of Arctic work, and our scientific traditions, there is no nation better suited to carry out such a mission. The hope is that the pole will be reached by balloon, and that this grand and dangerous enterprise will end in success. Andrée was a futurist, in every sense of the word, who clearly saw the balloon as more than a mere curiosity. To him it was a technological revolution, and one that he viewed as key to enhancing science or improving society in ways yet undreamed of. His life and career was unfolding during a time of breathtaking scientific advances, and expeditions into the vast untamed Arctic dominated discussions amongst scholars and explorers, and Andrée saw the balloon as the solution to conquering the pole and making his own impact on the sciences. However, many of the explorers and scientists gathered in front of him on this night in London as he presents his plans clearly disagree. The president of the society, Sir Clements Markham, demands to know how Andrée will navigate in fog. How could he collect specimens or conduct scientific study from a balloon? And what would he do if they crashed, trapping them there in the Arctic? Another member, Arthur Silva White, questioned the dirigibility of a balloon, their ability to be steered or directed. The American explorer Adolphus Greely was perhaps most forthright in his criticism. He derided André's claims that the balloon could remain airborne for so long, and if the southerly winds that Andrée predicted did exist, how could he be sure they would not simply converge at the North Pole and strand his balloon there? As geographers looking at these things from a practical point of view and having some knowledge of air and currents, Greely concluded, this Congress should not give the weight of their influence or their endorsement to this expedition. Andrée, by all accounts, seemed shaken and angry at what he saw as attacks not just on his plans, but on his very character. Responding point by point, he pushed back furiously. Fog would come and go, much like a ship navigating the sea. His balloon would be steered by an array of sails and draglines he had personally designed himself. When questioned about a crash, he pointed at the explorers in the room, asking what they would do if their ships were stranded in the ice. Rounding on Greely, Andrée demanded to know why his expedition should be considered more foolhardy than Greely's own, which had lost 18 of his 25-man team during an Arctic expedition barely a decade earlier. By the time he sat back down, witnesses describe Andrée wiping his brow of sweat and breathing heavily. To Andrée, the criticism from some quarters that his planned journey was nothing more than a stunt was an insult worse than any other. To have his passion for flight and methodical calculations on the expedition dismissed as a folly cut to his very core. Andrée had always been committed to his ideas, stubborn to a fault, and supremely confident in his abilities. And, like many explorers before him, faced with doubters who said his plans were not feasible, he intended to prove them wrong, or die in the attempt. Bringing this video together has been about 2.5 years of work, reading a lot of books and materials and newspapers, translating a lot of Swedish, including the men's diaries themselves, found on White Island in 1930. I even got the chance to visit Sweden a couple of years ago to see the museum where a lot of these artifacts recovered from White Island are kept and are on display to this day. As usual, none of this would have been possible without you guys and your support, but also from today's sponsor, Odoo. Odoo is the all-in-one management platform that has helped millions of businesses around the world transform and streamline the way they run their day-to-day processes. From project management to website building to intuitive accounting software, they have an app to suit all your business needs. Take, for example, Odoo's e-sign app. If you've ever had to download, print, sign, scan, upload, then email a contract, you know how endlessly complex and needlessly clunky that entire process can be. Gone now, though, are the days where you have to write a million order forms and invoices for silk balloons and Arctic exploration equipment. With Odoo's e-sign app, you can do all of that digitally in one place. Just upload your document, drag and drop fields like signature, names, initials, email addresses, whatever you want and wherever you need on the document. You can add multiple signers, specify who signs what, make fields mandatory or optional, determine a signing order, and then send automatic reminders to avoid delays, and then just send it off. The documents can then be accessed and signed from any device, and you can track all of this in real time. You can see who's signed, who's still waiting, or if any parts of the document have been declined. And when it's all done and signed off, you now have a fully compliant document under both US and EU digital signature laws. So whether you're approving sales, onboarding staff, signing people up to an Arctic balloon journey, you can save time, paper, and hassle using Odoo's e-sign app. You can try eSign for yourself and totally free. You can get access to all of Odoo's apps for a very affordable plan. But the first app is free for life with unlimited hosting and support. So thanks again, Odoo, for the support for this video, and let's get back to the Arctic balloon journey. Born in the small Swedish town of Gränna in 1854, Andrée grew up a methodical, stubborn, and endlessly curious child. He absorbed everything he could from the growing fields of science and technology. He was sociable and devoted to his family, especially to his mother after his father had died when he was just 16 years old. He seemed to possess no ear for music or art. His mind focused entirely on the literal, the physical, and the mechanical. At the age of 23, Andrée had travelled to America, where his first serious obsession with flight seemed to stir. He would return to Sweden only a few months later after falling ill, but his fascination with flight, and especially the possibilities of ballooning, only deepened. By the 1890s, Andrée had settled into a role at the Swedish Patent Office, one that suited his technical curiosity and focus, and found himself travelling across Europe, scouting for promising patents and meeting many inspiring scientific pioneers and inventors. Yet, ballooning continued to preoccupy him. With government support, he had commissioned the construction of his own balloon in 1893, and with it he made 9 ascents, once travelling nearly 240 miles from Gothenburg to Gotland, and another across the sea to Finland. On the 16th of March 1894, Andrée attended a meeting of the Swedish Anthropological and Geographical Society, and afterwards walked home with the famed Finnish-Swedish explorer Baron A.E. Nordenskjöld. Nordenskjöld, who had charted the Northeast Passage in 1878, was no doubt a hero of sorts to Andrée. During their conversations, Nordenskjöld shared his growing interest in the idea of using balloons for exploration, tethered above glaciers to give explorers the chance to survey the vast Arctic or Antarctic landscape from the air. Perhaps it was this discussion that finally ignited what had until then only been embers of an idea. Andrée, already one of Sweden's most experienced balloonists, saw beyond the stationary observation. Why not go further? Why not take a great balloon and fly it, traverse the polar wastes themselves, and in so doing, claim the North Pole for Sweden, for himself, and for the greater glory of science and technology? He debuted these plans in 1895, boasting that a balloon steered along the air currents could carry a team to the pole and back in a matter of days, simply skimming over the inhospitable landscapes that so many explorers and their ships had become unstuck by over the centuries. It would only take a week, he calculated, and with a balloon he designed that could stay aloft for almost a month, giving what he claimed to be a supreme margin of safety. Despite the critics, many of whom Andrée considered old-fashioned and stubborn in the face of his new ideas, the plan also had many supporters, especially in Sweden, who wholeheartedly believed in Andrée's unshakable convictions, confidence and expertise, and no doubt swept up in the idea of claiming the North Pole for king and country. One of Andrée's earliest collaborators in the enterprise was Dr. Niels Ekholm, a respected scientist and meteorologist who threw himself wholeheartedly into helping plan the expedition. Ekholm and Andrée had worked together before, when in 1882 Ekholm led an expedition to Spitsbergen for the first international polar year. Andrée had joined as a young assistant and impressed Ekholm with his keen methodical mind and his tireless dedication to scientific observation. What's more, Ekholm being part of Andrée's expedition now lent it an air of scientific credibility. The third member of the crew would be another Niels Strindberg of Stockholm. At just 24 years old, Strindberg was lively, bright and full of optimism. It's unclear how Niels joined the expedition. He perhaps won a competition or had learnt of the expedition through one of Andrée's talks. Strindberg's mother had recently passed away, and his father, Oscar, was initially sceptical of the expedition, but had been convinced and impressed by their meetings with Andrée. Andrée arranged for Niels to travel to Paris to practice ballooning, and as a skilled photographer, it would be Niels responsible for documenting the journey. Unsurprisingly, Andrée had meticulously planned the expedition's expenses to the finest detail. He estimated the total cost at 128,800 kroner, roughly equivalent to about 1.5 million US dollars today. At first, donations were slow to materialise, but momentum built quickly. The first major contribution came from none other than Alfred Nobel, who had known Andrée through his work at the Patent Office. Oscar Dixon, a well-known Swedish industrialist who had supported other Arctic expeditions, also lent his support. Soon, public donations, corporate sponsorships, promotional materials, publication rights from newspapers, and even the support of the King of Sweden himself swelled the expedition's coffers. One of the most expensive elements of the expedition would undoubtedly be the balloon itself. Created by the renowned balloonist Henri Lechambre in his Parisian workshop, it was one of the most technically impressive balloons ever made. The top half of the balloon was constructed of 3 layers of high-quality Chinese silk, the bottom 2. The 4,500 meters of seams that joined the 600 individual pieces of silk together were covered inside and out with silk strips and further varnished. Above all this was draped a huge net, woven from 384 cords of Italian hemp, each one 5.5 millimeters thick and 65 meters long. Finally, another layer of silk, known as a collet or skull cap, quadruple varnished and coated in Vaseline, was placed on top, intended to help divert rain and prevent build-ups of snow and ice, which would weigh the balloon down during its flight. Suspended beneath it by 6 steel cables was the gondola. Henri, in his account, describes its ingenious design and packaging. The car is marvellously devised. The lower part is completely surrounded in sailcloth. It receives its light through 2 lateral windows. The middle is occupied by a kind of mattress covered with a sleeping sack of reindeer skins. All around are compartments for holding books, charts and instruments, toilet articles and the kitchen utensils, arms, ammunition, etc. It is entered through a trapdoor made in the ceiling. Above, at a height of 1 metre, a ring mounted on jointed railings, permitting it to maintain its horizontal position, forms a balcony, in the centre of which the 2 explorers will remain while the third is resting. The extensive provisions, around 1,500 pounds of food, water and cooking supplies, were calculated to last about 3.5 months, with an emergency reserve that could, in theory, stretch to 6. To send updates back to civilization, the expedition carried buoys with sealed compartments for messages, intended to be dropped at intervals and carried home by the ocean currents. There was also one larger buoy, adorned with a flag and intended to be dropped on the North Pole itself. Also on board were 36 carrier pigeons strapped in small wicker baskets to the gondola, each able to carry a brief note home. No one had any idea if the pole lay surrounded by solid ground, thick ice or open sea. As such, they packed 3 custom-built sledges, each designed to Andrée's exacting specifications, as well as a collapsible dinghy. In preparation for a hike back home should the balloon be forced down, supply depots of food and provisions had also been pre-positioned on nearby islands. For defence and hunting, the team carried 2 rifles, a shotgun, a revolver, and a significant stock of ammunition. In the event that they drifted far afield, into Russia, Canada, or elsewhere, they even carried multiple currencies, including US dollars, Russian rubles, and Scandinavian kroner. One of the principal innovations in Andrée's plans, however, was the ability to steer the balloon. To achieve this, 3 sails were installed and designed to allow some dirigibility. A series of weighted drag lines, also soaked in Vaseline to stop them swelling with water, would be dragged under the balloon, which would, in theory, allow them some small control over speed, height and direction. Anchors and grapples were also on board to help land the balloon, and Andrée had designed a series of explosive bursting devices that could quickly tear the envelope and quickly release the gas. With the magnificent balloon's construction completed, the plans set, provisions packed and press tour completed, the expedition set sail in the summer of 1896, with over 40,000 people gathered at the docks to wave off the members of the expedition, packed onto their ship, the Virgo. The men all made their farewells, and Andrée sent a last letter to his beloved mother, who was increasingly frail and unable to see them off, writing, "Don't be uneasy, dear. Your heart is close beside me." They arrived in Spitsbergen on the 21st of June 1896, and after scouting the cold northern coastlines for a suitable location to build the balloon house and site their operation, they eventually settled on a small bay, enclosed with mountains and facing north. Free of snow and ice, it was home only to a small pre-existing house built by Englishman Arnold Pike, which the expedition were given permission to repurpose for their own uses. The team immediately set about with their work. The 2 carpenters in the party began constructing the vast wooden balloon hangar, a 4-story prefabricated frame in which the balloon could be filled and tied down within. A series of pipes snaked out and up towards the Pike House, where the hydrogen gas would flow. The complex and heavy gas-generating plant used iron filings and sulfuric acid, which reacted in large lead-lined troughs to release gas. This crude hydrogen was then passed through water to wash out impurities, cooled and then channeled into the balloon itself. It was a laborious and dangerous process, and made all the more difficult by the damp, cold air and the urgency of the brief Arctic summer. Despite all their preparations and hard work, by the end of July, the wind they so needed to pull them away from the balloon house and north had not materialised. Their ship, the Virgo, was only insured until midway through August and would soon need to return. What's more, the balloon seemed to lose gas erratically. Ekholm seemed to be increasingly concerned, noting that Pike's house seemed to be smelling strongly of hydrogen. The team chased leaks endlessly, applying patches and varnishing the canopy with little success. Andrée noted in a letter that once the leaks had been seen to, they'd launch as soon as possible, but the wind still refused to blow. Each of these delays, each miscalculation, from the balloon to the wind currents, must have gnawed at Andrée. For a man so confident in his abilities, so sure in his ambitions, each complication was a vindication to the critics back home who had lampooned his plans. What's more, the expedition had been ruinously expensive. Donors and patrons, friends and family, along with peers in Andrée's scientific world, had all donated generously, and newspapers, which had exclusive rights to their story, were now desperate for updates or information. To make matters worse, on the 14th of August, just as the last shreds of optimism of a launch that year were thinning out, a ship appeared on the horizon. Unbelievably, it was the Fram, the ship which had been on an expedition led by famed explorer Fridtjof Nansen to find the fabled Northwest Passage, had not been seen or heard from in almost 3 years. Strindberg, writing about its sudden appearance, was shocked by this ghost appearing after years of speculation as to its whereabouts. As we came within 500 meters distance, the name began to appear, and I was the first to confirm it was the Fram. It was like a dream. What a strange coincidence. What a peculiar twist of fate. It's notable that Andrée made little to no note of the Fram's appearance. Perhaps he was concerned that the Fram was now returning from a successful trip to the North Pole, beating him to the punch and making this entire expedition pointless. However, the news from the Fram was even more incredible. The crew tell the balloonists that Nansen is not even on board. Over its 35 months trapped, it hadn't reached the North Pole, instead being stuck in an ice pack where it had zigzagged across the polar sea before being spat out near Spitsbergen. Nansen and his lieutenant, Fredrik Johansson, had struck out on foot, attempting to reach the pole over the ice after the ship had failed to drift closer. The crew are unsure if they'll ever see them again. Days later, Nansen and Johansson would reach the Norwegian coast themselves after an arduous journey that brought them close but not to the North Pole. But on that frozen shore, Andrée would not know that. He would just return to his leaking balloon on that windless shore and consider his options. But by now, there was no more time to launch. The following day, Andrée wrote, "Today we sharpened the scissors with which the balloon will be cut apart. They will return next year, but for Andrée there can be no more delays, no more chances of someone else stealing the pole. Perhaps that day something was decided in Andrée, silently, privately, and fatally." It is the 11th of July, 1897, on Danes Island, and the wind is blowing north. Andrée visits the shore early in the morning, reviewing the wind speed and direction. He has little to say. He says he needs an hour to think. Eventually, the men of the expedition gather on the roof of the balloon house, staring at the inflated balloon. The balloon has been altered in Paris over the last 12 months, strengthened, enlarged, and further varnished. The wind is telling them they can finally launch. Andrée seems nervous. "Shall we try it or not?" he asks. Strindberg says they should. Andrée doesn't reply. Eventually they head back in silence to their ship, the Virgo, which has accompanied them to Danes Island again this year. Strindberg is frustrated by André's almost paralytic indecisiveness, which has caused them to not launch for days now. The crew of the Virgo fume at André's lack of resolve. But arriving back at the ship, Andrée seems to suddenly pipe up, turning to the captain of the Virgo. "My companions insist on starting, and as I have absolutely no valid reasons against it, I shall agree to it, though with some reluctance." Why is Andrée so reluctant? He is a careful and calculating man, but even those closest to him seem to sense something else, a growing hesitation, perhaps a slow, creeping acceptance that his great vision may not work after all. The expedition, the donors and contracts, the wicker gondola sitting waiting for them. Everything Andrée has built is beginning to close in around him. It had been a difficult winter. When they had returned home in 1896 from their failed attempt, Dr. Niels Ekholm, the famed scientist, the second man of the expedition, who had worked with Andrée for so long, quit. Ekholm had come to believe the balloon would be a failure. He had grown concerned about its ability to hold gas, but during the filling process in Spitsbergen, something didn't add up. The measurements seemed to be erratic. The balloon seemed to lose and gain gas at unpredictable intervals. Later, back in Sweden, he discovered why. Andrée had arranged for extra hydrogen to be pumped into the balloon, skewing the data and seemingly not disclosing the fact with Ekholm and the others in the team. Had this been a simple oversight, a lack of communication, or a deliberate attempt to cover up the truth? Ekholm couldn't be sure, but the breach of trust was enough. He wanted nothing more to do with the expedition. In one extraordinary act, he even boarded a train with the King of Sweden himself, Oscar II, and tried to convince him to withdraw his support for the expedition. Andrée was incensed. He claimed Ekholm had simply lost his nerve, and now wished to sabotage the venture to save face when it ultimately succeeded. To replace him, Andrée turned to Knut Frankel, a young civil engineer from Karlstad. Frankel was a capable athlete who learnt fast in his training, but the expedition had lost the man widely regarded as the foremost expert in Arctic weather, and the crucial scientific credibility for the trip. And Ekholm's warnings that the balloon would fail, that Andrée's predictions that it could stay aloft as long as he claimed were incorrect, carried weight that dragged the entire expedition down as they prepared to return in 1897. As this storm brewed around him, Andrée's world seemed to contract. The critics and doubters to his plans had grown louder. Over the winter, he had exchanged letters with the recently returned Fridtjof Nansen, who had urged Andrée to caution and reconsider his plans. Nansen had spent years trapped in the Arctic and clearly feared and doubted Andrée's ability to withstand something similar. Then, Andrée's supporters began to die. Alfred Nobel, the expedition's first and most generous sponsor, passed away in December 1896. Not long after, Oscar Dixon, the expedition's second major patron, also died. And then, most devastating of all, Andrée's beloved mother. Outwardly, Andrée remained stoic, but inside, something had cracked. "Now all my personal interest in the expedition has gone," he wrote. "To be sure, I am still interested in carrying out my idea. I have the same feeling of responsibility for my companions, but of the personal sense of joy there is not a trace. The only thread which bound me to wish to live is cut off. No doubt all of those who start on enterprises like mine have somewhere a purely individual interest, a feeling of happiness at the thought of someone in whose arms they may wish to rest after a completed task. In my case, it was only my mother that this individual interest was attached. And you can therefore sense perhaps what I have lost." All this, the doubts, the fear, the sadness, the betrayal and uncertainty, swirls in Andrée's mind as he watches the crew now frantically prepare for the launch of the balloon. Strindberg moves quietly through the chaos, taking photographs of the scene, the massive envelope, the tangle of gear and equipment, still all stamped with Andrée's balloon journey 1896. He had hoped to write one final letter to his beloved fiancée, Anna, but there is no time. As the men enter the balloon's gondola at 1:43 p.m, all he can do is urge for his love to be passed back to her, tears catching in his eyes. Suddenly, Andrée cries out the command, "Cut away everything." 3 knives flash, the final lines are severed. At 1:55 p.m. on the 11th of July, 1897, the balloon lurches upward, rising into the grey Arctic sky. Cheers erupt from the crew, hats are thrown, voices cry out, "Long live Sweden." But something is wrong. A loud impact echoes off the side of the balloon house. Someone hears Andrée shout, "What the devil was that?" The balloon twists violently, then plunges downwards towards the sea. The gondola begins to dip into the freezing water. In a panic, ballast bags are cut loose, and the balloon jerks upward again, swaying and climbing unevenly. On the ground, the men realise what has happened. The guide ropes, designed to drag underneath the balloon and provide friction for steering, have twisted and come undone, now lying in a tangled mess on the shore. Without them, the sails can do little. Andrée's system for steering the balloon has failed within seconds. They are now almost entirely at the mercy of the wind. After this disaster, perhaps the men on shore expected Andrée to bring the balloon back down, but he doesn't. Minutes before launch, Andrée christened the balloon the Eagle. Now the Eagle slips into the sky, drifting north, its envelope vanishing into the low cloud. It would never be seen again. It is 6 p.m, over 5 hours since the Eagle launched. The three men, Andrée, Strindberg and Frankel, eat their first meal aboard the balloon. Over the hours, the balloon has drifted in and out of cloud, mist, sunlight and shadow. Floating above the broken pack ice at around 2,000 feet, they are utterly alone, save for the occasional bird that drifts past with silent curiosity. Beneath them lies a shifting, cracking wilderness of white and grey. The still, silent vastness of the Arctic spreads out beneath them in every direction. Frankel takes studious notes of their positions. Strindberg photographs the horizon, then begins recording observations in his logbook. After their first dinner, an exhausted Andrée descends into the gondola's lower cabin to rest. He has written almost nothing in his own diary since the launch, and sleep does not come easy. The weight of the botched takeoff must hang heavy in the cramped silence. Eventually he sleeps. Strindberg and Frankel remain above, whispering across the deck so as not to wake him. Strindberg continues his log through the night, recording their altitude at regular intervals. Just before 9:43 p.m, as the balloon dips around 1,650 feet, they jettison a buoy to reduce weight. It works and the balloon lifts again. Inside is a short message. Buoy number 4, the first thrown out. Our journey so far has gone well. 4 carrier pigeons were sent off at 5:40 p.m. They flew westerly. We are now over the ice, which is broken up in all directions. Weather magnificent, in best of humours. The buoy wouldn't be found for another 3 years. Andrée, Frankel and Strindberg have less than 3 months left to live. Andrée now takes the night shift. By morning, as Strindberg and Frankel prepare coffee and eat breakfast, the Eagle is flying dangerously low, at times hovering just 15 metres above the ice. The balloon dips in shade and cloud, but even as it passes back into clear sunshine, it struggles to rise. Moisture from the fog clings to the netting and the balloon's silk skin, adding weight gram by gram, minute by minute. Andrée had convinced himself, and everyone around him, that the balloon would stay aloft for 30 days, but barely 30 hours have passed and it is already sinking. Hydrogen is escaping. It always has been. The varnished seams and triple-coated silk were never gas-tight. Andrée had once described balloons as uniquely suited to the Arctic, as the constant daylight would keep the hydrogen warm. But he never seemed to account much for fog and shade and clouds, which now envelops, soaks and deposits ice on every surface of the vessel. It also cools the hydrogen, further sapping its ability to lift. Andrée writes in his diary, "Fog still dense. Everything is dripping, and the balloon heavily weighted down." The crew begins throwing off anything they can: sandbags, ropes, an iron anchor, pulley systems. More carrier pigeons are now released. One circles the balloon, others, confused, land on the ice below and eventually fly off into the mist. Finally, they discard their largest and perhaps most symbolic object, the buoy, adorned with a flag meant to be planted at the North Pole. The act is mentioned but not commented upon in much detail in any diary, but it's now clear that dream is over. As their second day in the air draws to a close, all 3 men are exhausted, unable to rest due to the constant impacts as the gondola drags along the frozen ground. The balloon finally snags something though, a guide rope securing it, at least temporarily, to a block of ice. Now unmoving and hanging low off the ground, in a moment of respite, the other 2 men sleep while Andrée sits on watch and writes. It is not a little strange to be floating here above the polar sea, to be the first to have floated here in a balloon. How soon, I wonder, shall we have successors? Shall we be thought mad, or will our example be followed? We think we can well face death, having done what we have done. The rattling of the guidelines in the snow and the flapping of the sails are the only sounds heard, except the whining in the basket. That night, the wind blew south. Had they freed the guideline that was holding them there in place, the Eagle could have been carried on these northerly winds all the way back to Spitsbergen by morning. But the opportunity is missed. When the balloon finally judders free, the wind has shifted. At 1 p.m, the third group of pigeons is released. The birds again first settle on the envelope and then fly off confused. 2 days later, a bird will be spotted clinging to the mast of a Norwegian sealer, its head tucked beneath its wing in exhaustion. The captain shoots it, and the bird tumbles overboard. Later, learning about Andrée's expedition, the crew suspect it may have been one of their pigeons. They'll return to the site and, with remarkable luck, recover its body still floating in the sea. And tied to its leg is a message from Andrée's polar expedition, July 13th, 12:30 midday. Good speed east, all well on board. This is the third pigeon post. Back aboard the balloon, the bumping and scraping continues without rest. The men are again exhausted. Strindberg, worn down by the constant jolts, is overcome by motion sickness. Analysing the logs left by Andrée, Strindberg and Frankel allow us to plot a graph of the balloon's flight. After its chaotic launch, the balloon begins a steady ascent, reaching its peak altitude that evening. But by midnight, the descent begins a slow, terminal decline. No matter how much weight they throw overboard, the escaping hydrogen and accumulating moisture and ice continues to drag the balloon down. By 8 p.m. on the 13th of July, they realise something must be done to try and arrest the constant dragging and impacts. More equipment, the remaining buoys, winches and even some provisions are now cast off. For a brief period, the balloon rises once more, the sails catch wind, speed increases, but it does not last. Strindberg climbs higher into the rigging to escape the constant shocks. There he scribbles notes to Anna, makes observations about their provisions and tests his snowshoes. He notes the clothing he's wearing, a final act of record-keeping before facing what now must be the inevitable ice. He sees a pigeon return, disorientated and unable to find a direction to fly. In one of his last notes from the air, Strindberg writes, "I read Anna's last letter. It was a really enjoyable moment." A few lines later, he makes a final entry in his flight log. Anchored on an ice floe, 7:30 a.m., July 14. 40 minutes later, according to Andrée's diaries, the men leapt from the balloon, exhausted and famished. The flight is over. They have flown approximately 517 miles, roughly 300 north of where they started, and 300 still from the pole. Andrée had predicted that they would need almost a week in the air to reach the pole and return. The balloon had been calculated to last a month in the air. In the end, it had struggled to stay aloft for all of 66 hours. The small party and their half-deflated balloon, stranded on the ice like a huge beached whale, are utterly alone. As the balloon lies stranded, half-deflated on its side, the vast tranche of provisions and equipment is broken out. The party spend the first days on the ice reorganising supplies and preparing for a march back to civilization. Strindberg makes multiple exposures with his camera. One shows the remains of the balloon's vast canopy, cut up for spares. Another shows their makeshift camp. The collapsible boat is visible, as is their tent. Piles of supplies sit under cover. Andrée stands atop the gondola, surveying the horizon for any sight of land. According to the charts they have available to them, they are faced with two main options. The northern tip of Spitsbergen, some 192 miles away to the south-southwest, or to Franz Josef Land to the southeast at a distance of around 210 miles. Both locations have provisions of food, fuel and ammunition in place should they reach them. Strindberg, alongside his meticulous notes on supplies and provisions, writes in shorthand to Anna on the 22nd, a week now since they had landed on the ice. It is nearly 7 p.m. and we have just packed our sledges, ready and intending to start from our landing place. We shall see how we manage to get to Cape Flora. The sledges are heavy to pull. The men have ultimately decided to make for Cape Flora on Franz Josef Land. It is a cold, inhospitable place, but they will be well aware that it was here that Fridtjof Nansen had overwintered during his own expedition just a couple of years earlier. The terrain is appalling. ice ridges like frozen waves tower above them, broken by melt ponds and slushy channels. Each sledge is packed with over 200 kilograms, an impossible weight for one man to haul across the ice. Instead, they must work in tandem, all three of them pushing each sledge, working it over obstacles before returning for the next. Strindberg takes an impressive exposure with his camera, showing the three men struggling to force the large boat and sledge through the ice. Even the incredibly strong and athletic Frankel begins to feel the strain. In his diary, Andrée meticulously notes the contents of his sledge, totaling some 210 kilograms. On the next page, he details his attempts at lightening the load, the sledge now weighing some 129.5 kilograms. Meanwhile, Strindberg writes to Anna. July 24th. We have stopped for the day, and after drudging and pulling the sledges for 10 hours, I am really rather tired, but I first must chat a little. First and foremost, I must congratulate you, for it is your birthday. Oh, how I wish I could tell you that I am in excellent health, and that you need not fear for us at all. The men raise a toast to Anna for her birthday, but in the cramped tent, stranded amid impassable ice, weighed down by heavy equipment and unaccustomed to such hardships, a sense of reality must be sinking in. There must now be a growing realization that with the slow and difficult progress made just in the last few days, they may not reach Franz Josef Land by the end of the summer. They may in fact have to face overwintering on the drifting ice itself. A few lines later, Strindberg continues, Yes, it is strange to think that not even for your next birthday will it be possible for us to be home, and perhaps we will have to winter here for another year more. We do not know yet, and we are now moving onward so slowly that perhaps we will not reach Cape Flora this winter, but like Nansen will have to pass the winter in an earth cellar. Poor little Anna, and what despair you will be if we should not come home next autumn. They soon fall into a punishing routine, hauling sledges across treacherous ice, setting up camp, making repairs, cooking meals and trying to rest. Their trusty Primus stove is a lifeline. It boils their morning coffee, cooks their meals and provides a modicum of heat. They huddle each night in their thin tent, draped in garments and layers of jumpers, sharing a single 3-man reindeer skin sleeping bag. After a few hours of sleep in the constant 24-hour sunshine, they awake, repack their camp and slog onwards, pulling their heavy sledges once more. But their labour has been almost entirely in vain. With every agonising step east towards Franz Josef Land, they are being subtly pulled constantly west. The drifting ice is cancelling out their efforts, sometimes even pulling them back further. Their most valuable early reserves of strength are being sapped with little to show for it. It is now a long time since I chatted with you, Strindberg writes to Anna on the 31st of July. His diary pages here are faded, with only fragments remaining legible. Since then, the situation has... After this day, Nils stops writing to Anna. On the 4th of August, the men change course entirely. Franz Josef Land is abandoned. They now aim southwest, hoping that the same currents and winds that had so worked against them might now carry them towards the Seven Islands at the far northern edge of Spitsbergen. The landscape shifts again. Andrée describes it as dreadful country, a terrain pocked with fresh melt pools and slush, where crossing becomes a nightmare. Frankel begins to suffer and complains frequently. Already afflicted by snow blindness, he now endures relentless bouts of diarrhea. Andrée treats him with opium, but it offers little relief. They are frequently soaked to the skin after falling through the thin ice. Their feet and hands ache. Sores and blisters and boils form from the constant hauling and manoeuvring of boats and sledges. Temperatures hover around 0 degrees Celsius. Their boots and clothes are wearing thin, the equipment frequently breaking. Constant repairs are needed just to keep moving. As the men wear themselves out, they still continue to write, dutifully noting positions, weather and supply inventories. But another thread seems to run through Andrée's diary. Each day, amid the exhaustion and cold, he continues his scientific observations, recording natural history, sketching diagrams of ice formations, cataloguing wildlife, algae and rock samples. He takes soundings through the ice to measure the depth of the sea below. It's as if Andrée, even now, stranded and dwindling out here far from civilization, can still hear the criticisms of Sir Clements Markham echoing from London, the accusation that his plans lacked scientific merit. Andrée no doubt considered his diary valuable, scientific observations of a landscape few humans had ever walked upon or seen. Should they make it home, an account of their survival will also no doubt be incredibly valuable to publish. But extracted from the rest of the diary, the sheer volume of notes borders on mania, a refusal to let go that has characterised André's stubborn mind his whole life. As the party's supplies dwindle, their bodies wear out, their cache of rocks, samples and scientific trinkets only grows. September 4th, Strindberg birthday, festal day. I awakened him, giving him letters from his sweetheart and relations. It was a real pleasure to see how glad he was. Today we have had some extra food in honour of the occasion. The breakfast consists of bear's meat and bread, with Stoffer's pea soup, and bear's meat and bear's fat. Dinner, fried bear's meat, kept warm inside our waistcoats. Supper, bear's meat, bread and pâté foie gras. Stoffer cake with syrup sauce, syrup and water. Speech for Nils, and lactocerin chocolate. As he reads his letters, Niels no doubt holds one of his most prized possessions, a locket containing a picture of Anna and a lock of her hair. His diary no longer contains messages to her. It has now just been reduced to simple observations of meals and supplies. But perhaps he takes a moment to let his thoughts just drift home. He had just turned 25 years old, and it would be his last birthday. The march continues. They have now been stranded, pulling sledges and dwindling supplies through the ice for over a month. Frankel's foot is now so bad he can hardly pull a sledge. In a cruel twist of fate, the current still works against them. Despite their best efforts, they are now being carried south-southeast, missing the Seven Islands and the coast of Spitsbergen entirely. André's diary also begins to thin out. He doesn't write again now until the 17th, but it's followed by a crude drawing. This day has been a remarkable one for us, because of our having seen land today for the first time since July 11th. It is undoubtedly New Iceland that we have come in sight of. Its appearance is shown in the appended drawing. The men spare some of their rations to create a feast to celebrate Jubilee Day, the 25th anniversary of the King of Sweden, and no doubt to celebrate the sighting of landfall, the end of their daily ruinous march, and perhaps the bleak hope of escape. In the distance lies the white, featureless smear of the barren island. Andrée calls it New Iceland. Other sources call it Gillisland. Many know it simply as White Island. The men do not know it yet, but it is where their journey will come to an end. With the enroaching polar night closing in, the men begin to prepare for overwintering on the ice. They find themselves on a particularly thick floe of ice drifting in and around the coastline of White Island. Andrée hopes it will drift further south to see where they might find rescue. It's possible they also disagreed here, with some arguing to stay on the island. But on the 16th, Strindberg notes, resolved to remain on the ice. They have spent months sleeping together in a single tent. The men are unwashed, racked with injuries and returning bouts of diarrhea. The abhorrent conditions were punishing on their march, but would be incomprehensible for an entire winter. They make preparations to build a larger shelter, cutting and shaping snow into ice blocks and calling the small structure simply home. Strindberg, who seems to be leading the building effort, sketches it in his almanac. It is a relatively spacious 3-room shelter with space for sleeping, a small living area with a table and supplies, and a storeroom at the entranceway. But the floe beneath them is now becoming somewhat precarious. Andrée sketches its rough shape, but notes the sounds of cracking and the erosion near the edges of the floe. What's more, bears, now more desperate with the oncoming winter, appear more frequently, stealing meat and often startling the men as they work. On the 28th of September, the men move into their house, but Strindberg notes it is not ready, but it is the first time they have slept with a roof over their heads in months. At 5:30 a.m. in the morning, however, a massive crash wakes them. Water begins rushing into the shelter. Scrambling outside, they see that the floe has split, carrying off equipment and supplies, scattering across the drifting ice. They urgently race to recover what they can, then grab a few hours' sleep in the damaged hut, which now hangs precariously at the new edge of their floe. There seems to be more disagreement here about what to do next. In a rare note, Andrée has mentioned tensions between the men. What were they arguing about? We'll never know. But it is here that our notes begin to break down. Strindberg's diary has become little more than 1 or 2 word summaries. The 3rd and 4th of October, the days following the floe's collapse, are marked simply exciting situation. The 5th moved to land. André's final diary pages were damaged by exposure to the elements, but a few phrases remain legible. He writes of energetic labour as they haul their remaining supplies over the glacier, having seemingly decided to establish camp on the shores of White Island. They find a sheltered, ice-free section about 65 metres from the shore along the side of a rocky outcrop. Andrée seems to name it M Place. We can guess that this might have been Mina André's place, named for his late mother. Her birthday would have been the 6th of October, around the time they arrived there. Around the 8th of October, there are mentions in both diaries of scouting the landscape. Andrée appears to mention plans to build a hut using driftwood and whalebones, but that shelter would never be completed. This is the last entry in André's diary. Strindberg's almanac contains his last entry. It cryptically reads, home, 7:05 a.m, but it's written on the 17th, days after his and André's previous entries around the 7th and 8th, and instead of pencil, like the rest of the diaries, it is written in ink. It's unlikely Niels had ink with him. It's more likely he wrote this last note before he left for the expedition. He probably expected the 17th of October to be the date he returned home, the 7:05 a.m. train pulling into Stockholm, where his fiancée Anna would be there to meet him to begin their life together. How did the men finally die? We'll never know exactly, but a detailed layout of the site and an inventory of what was found during excavations in 1930 may help us build a theory. The main feature of the camp was the shelter. 2 driftwood logs and a whalebone marked the foundations and were probably there to help pin down the tent, which leaned against a rock face. Andrée had mentioned building a shelter of wood and whalebones, and a collection of driftwood was nearby. A few feet away, towards the shore, 2 of the party's sledges were present, surrounded by much of their equipment. The collapsible canvas boat was strapped to one of these sledges, and filled with over 100 different items. The 3rd and final sledge was found about 25 feet away to the southwest, and seemed to be unloaded or relatively empty. It appears the camp had only been recently established. In fact, it looks as if the men were perhaps interrupted while unpacking their supplies. Taking a closer look at the boat and sledges, they were still filled with a large number of unpacked items, with many more scattered around. There were snowshoes, clothing, bags and several books, the expedition's scientific equipment and countless boxes of provisions, tools and containers. Animals over the years had disturbed the camp, opening and scattering many of the bags and boxes, but perhaps most telling of all, 2 of the party's rifles still sat in the boat where they were originally left. Only the most essential items had made it to the small tent, pitched against the rock face. Rubber sheeting or varnished silk had been laid down for basic flooring. The 3-man reindeer skin sleeping bag lay crumpled against the south wall. Inside the tent were scattered the medicine chest, matches, provision boxes and a few other items. Undoubtedly, the party's most prized possession, their Primus stove, was found there too, resting on a stone ledge. In a testament to its robust design, it still contained fuel and was fully functional when discovered in 1930. It was inside this tent area that the bodies of Knut Frankel and Salomon Augustus Andrée were found. Frankel lay on the tent floor, encased in layers of solid ice. He appeared to be covered in blankets and garments, his hand possibly wedged under his head. He wore several layers of clothing, but no mittens or hat, and his boots were found nearby, apparently unlaced. Andrée was on the rocky shelf above. He appeared better dressed, wearing boots, mittens, a hat and jacket, but it's hard to know if he was dressed for inside or outside. His position up here might not have been covered by the tent. He sat near the stove, an aluminium cup with food residue near his side, and a rifle and axe beside him. His trouser pockets were stuffed with matches and cartridges. With him was Strindberg's purse, filled with personal items. Strindberg's photography equipment and negatives, held in protective containers, were also nearby. Wrapped in balloon cloth and grass and stuffed under his garments for protection was his large diary. A second fragment of his diary was found in his jacket pocket, but partially ruined by the elements. This is where we get his final entries. Strindberg's almanac, with notes from the whole journey, was found near Frankel, along with Frankel's meteorological journal. Andrée's diary ended on the 8th of October, Strindberg's on the 7th. Frankel's last entry was dated the 3rd. About 115 feet away to the northeast of this camp, a rocky grave contained the body of Niels Strindberg. His booted feet still stuck out from the stones. He had been buried wearing 2 pairs of long johns, a pair of trousers, 3 jumpers, and a vest. His jacket had been removed before the burial and rolled up. It was found later at the outskirts of the camp. Body parts, part of Andrée's spine and pelvis, Frankel's right leg and foot, his pelvis and some other bones were found scattered around the camp. These had undoubtedly ended up there in the months and years after the men's death, as scavenging animals picked apart the camp. At the time, the crew of the Brattvag who discovered the camp concluded they had died of exposure, that their lack of furs and inadequate winter gear had finished them off in the encroaching darkness and plunging winter temperatures. It is true that they lacked heavy Arctic clothing and now faced a long winter alone in plunging temperatures, but the fact that so much additional clothing remained unpacked in the sledges suggests they weren't desperate, at least at that moment, for insulation. Later theories have pointed to food poisoning, perhaps from lead leaching from the soldered tin cans they carried, but tests in the 1990s on a fingernail found in a glove showed elevated but non-lethal levels of lead. The men were undoubtedly ill, weakened by exhaustion, hauling sledges for months in sub-zero temperatures, and all afflicted with persistent bouts of diarrhea and other digestive issues. It is possible in these final weeks and days that they succumbed to one or more illnesses, exacerbated by these poor conditions. Niels was buried while at least one other of the men still had the strength to do so, but whomever died next was seemingly unable to be buried by the remaining man. Some other theories have suggested psychosis, that the men turned on each other. Certainly there must have been disagreements and arguments during the journey. Towards the end of his diary on the floe, Andrée let slip of disagreements amongst the men. But overall, the diaries and writing left behind show a group that stayed cohesive, practical and supportive to the very end. Taking the time to bury Strindberg, protecting their diaries and documents, also makes this seem more unlikely. Autopsies at the time found no bullet wounds or clear signs of struggle, though both Andrée and Frankel's bodies had been heavily disturbed over the years. Strindberg was likely the first to have died, or at least he was not the last. Andrée had around him the stove, his gun, the diaries, and was heavily dressed, implying he may have been the last to pass away. Based on his clothing and where he lay, it seems Frankel died in the tent, possibly without his boots or mittens on, as if he was resting or not dressed for the outdoors. Some elements of each of these theories may be true, or perhaps something else entirely unaccounted for. But there is another possibility as to how this journey finally unwound, a threat that had stalked the men all across the ice and onto White Island. Throughout the journey, Andrée and Strindberg had recorded numerous bear encounters. The animals had been a source of food and had usually been shot or frightened off. But as the season wore on and the expedition moved further south, the encounters became more frequent. The bears seemed to be getting bolder. By the time they were on the ice floe, Andrée described marauding bears that stole food and loitered around the camp. The night bears seemed to be a kind of marauder. The one that visited us last night dragged away our big seal twice, and we would have lost it had not Strindberg succeeded in coming so near to the bear as to frighten him and making him drop his prize. At one point, in the middle of August, Andrée found a bear right in front of him as he opened his tent. I heard a noise outside the tent, and when I looked through the crack in the opening, I saw a bear close to my nose. Frankel took one of our guns, which by chance we had taken into the tent for cleaning, and crept out. The bear then stood a few steps from him to attack, but was met with a shot. For her book, The Expedition, author Bea Ozma studied the clothing recovered from Strindberg's body, as well as combing through every detail of the camp and autopsy reports of the men. She was able to compile the various theories on the men's death and provide evidence for and against each. But most crucially, she noted clear tears across the trousers Nils wore in his grave, tears that cut so deep that they went into his long johns underneath. Similarly, his jacket, which had been removed before burial and bundled up, was also torn by what could be the claws of a bear. Using the evidence available to us, we can perhaps create a theory. The men are exhausted from pulling their supplies up the gravel shore and establishing their new camp on White Island. They've now moved all their supplies, which were almost lost on the floe, to Mina's place, as Andrée called it, and begun to prepare for overwintering. They've erected the tent, pinned against the rock wall, and have gathered driftwood to further reinforce it. They're now getting ready to offload the final of the two sledges. But suddenly they notice a bear entering the camp. It was unlikely to have been the first. During their scouting of the island, they probably encountered several. Perhaps it, like others before, attempts to steal food from their stores, but they have grown used to the animals by now, perhaps overly so. Unlike their earlier encounter in the tent, they don't have a gun nearby. At least two of them are still stashed nearby in the boat. Strindberg, perhaps overly confident from past encounters, tries to scare it off as he had done on the floe, getting dangerously close, just as Andrée once described. But this bear is not frightened. It is starving and unwilling to let go of its meal, and it pounces at Nils. The bear slashes at Nils' leg, tearing through his trousers and into his flesh below. It rakes its claws across his shoulder, piercing his jacket. Andrée dashes for a weapon. Perhaps Frankel attempts to help, tries to drag the bear off Strindberg, but he is unable to, or even injured himself. Eventually, Andrée retrieves his rifle and shoots. The bear falls, but Nils is now mortally wounded. The medical kit is retrieved, but there is little they can do. Andrée, who had promised Anna and Nils' father Oscar that he would bring the young man home safely, now kneels by his mauled and bleeding body. Nils, who stuck alongside Andrée even after Ekholm had quit the expedition, after becoming engaged and leaving his new fiancée behind, is dead. They muster what strength they have left to bury him in a shallow grave, wedged into a rocky crevice and covered with stones. Andrée pockets Nils' purse, perhaps hoping he can one day return it, or at the very least keep it safe until they are found. They retreat back to their camp, too despondent or perhaps too sick or too injured to unload any more of the sledges. Knut Frankel was a practical man, late to join the expedition and largely overlooked. His meteorological diary offers few personal thoughts, but we know he bore much of the physical burden of the journey. A keen athlete, he pushed himself more than anyone else, hauling the heavy sledge that carried their canvas boat. He had injured his foot, suffered terrible snow blindness, and was plagued by relentless bouts of diarrhea that must have exhausted and dehydrated him. Sick, tired and injured, his body has almost given up. Perhaps with the death of his friend Nils, it was the final straw. He lies in their half-assembled tent beside the medicine chest, but he is gravely ill, and perhaps wounded from the same attack that killed Nils. He dies soon after. He was just 27 years old. Possibly now only Andrée remains, the man who brought them here, who had so carefully planned, so passionately fought for this expedition. He sits on the rocky shelf by their Primus stove, his rifle by his side. The camp, named for his beloved mother, whose death had sapped so much of his passion and his drive for this very journey, lies half-built, already beginning to freeze into history. He wraps his diary in balloon cloth and dried grass and tucks it behind his back and waits. Solomon Augustus Andrée was a week from his 43rd birthday. In the weeks and months that followed the balloon's launch, newspapers around the world buzzed with speculation. The last confirmed message was from the carrier pigeon that had been retrieved from the sea on the 15th of July. But just a week later, the New York Times reported that another pigeon had been found, this one in northern Norway, with the words "North Pole Passed, 15th" stamped on its wing. The paper speculated that the balloon might now be drifting towards Point Barrow, Alaska. Adolphus Grisly, with whom Andrée had argued with on the feasibility of the balloon, was reached out to for comment. My opinions on André's projected expedition and his probable return were expressed at the 6th International Geographical Congress in July 1895 in London, where I debated the subject publicly with Professor Andrée. While I believe that Andrée will never return, experience teaches us that miraculous things occur daily. Further rumours abounded. In November, a ship captain sailing near Spitsbergen thought he spotted a large reddish object floating in the sea. Another claimed to have heard shouts and screams from a nearby island. There were reports of native Inuit in Greenland who spotted a balloon flying low, drifting off into the distance. Others claimed they heard gunshots on the ice. Search parties were launched to Alaska and Franz Josef Land, but with nothing to show for it. Days gave way to weeks, then months. Soon a year had passed. Amazingly, in August 1898, a small Swedish scientific expedition landed on White Island. Unbeknownst to them, they were just a few hundred metres from André's final camp. The 3 men had died there perhaps only 9 months earlier, but the landing party was quickly driven back by fog and drifting ice that made anchoring near the barren island so dangerous. Few others would return for decades. A.E. Nordenskjöld, who had inspired and supported André's original ideas, still held out hope as late as 1900. He died in 1901. Henri Lachambre, the balloon's creator, died in 1904. Oskar Strindberg, Niels' father, passed away in 1905. Niels Ekholm died in 1923. Fridtjof Nansen died in May 1930, only months before the expedition's final camp was discovered. In August 1930, Anna Hotri was visiting cousins of the Strindberg family in Sweden. It was there, by chance, that she received the news. Her fiancé had finally been found. The loss of Niels had broken Anna Charlier. She, more than anyone, had clung to a desperate hope that they might be found, long after most others had given up. In 1900, Oskar Strindberg had written, "There are times when she is mourning, but she never torments anyone with her pain and despair. Her faith is cruel, and it hurts my heart. I cannot believe how brutal life sometimes can be." Over the years, Anna lived with the Strindbergs and spent time in and out of hospitals and sanatoriums. Every news story and rumour, every report and discovery, every false hope had been a quiet torture that haunted her for decades. In 1908, she met an Englishman named Gilbert Hawtrey, who taught French at a school in New Hampshire. Anna taught music there for a time, and in 1930 they moved to England. Her home was said to be filled with photographs of Niels and the Strindberg family, with whom she had remained close. It was simply by coincidence that she found herself in Sweden when the fateful news arrived. Andrée, Frankel and Strindberg returned to Sweden as heroes. They were men out of time, and the criticism of what many had called a folly was also in the past. They were now brave pioneers who had strived to reach the pole and claim it in the name of their country, part of a romantic era that now felt for many so far away. Their remains were received by King Gustav V, and thousands gathered on the streets of Stockholm to witness their funeral procession. All 3 men were cremated. Andrée, ever the futurist, had been a passionate supporter of the idea, and their remains were committed to the grounds of Stockholm's northern cemetery. A great stone monument was erected over the ashes, adorned with carved reliefs of the men, their balloon, and their attempt at the pole. Anna was not in attendance at the funeral. She sent a wreath inscribed simply, "To Niels from Anna," and soon returned home to England with her husband. Anna, who had spent 30 years trying to reconcile the loss of Niels, now had to live through it all again. She passed away in 1949. She too was cremated and buried in a cemetery in Torquay, England. That same year, on the 4th of September, what would have been Niels Strindberg's 77th birthday, members of his family gathered at his grave. With them, they carried a small box, given to them by Anna's husband, Gilbert. They lowered it into the earth near Niels's grave. Inside the box were ashes of Anna's heart. An engraved description laid upon the box gleamed in the light. Ashes from near the heart of Anna Albertina Constantia Hotry, née Charlier, to be placed near the grave of Niels Strindberg, to whom she was engaged in 1897. And may the great conductor allow them both to share in the music of the spheres.